All right, hello, good afternoon, everybody. Cool. Hi, my name is Ryan. I'm one of the young scholars here. I'm a recent graduate of St. Olaf, and happy to welcome you all to another Kierkegaard lecture. We're very excited to have David Lappano with us today. David grew up in Ontario, Canada, has spent several years living, teaching, and studying in the UK. He currently holds degrees in literature, education, and theology, and has spent most of his adult life involved in education, either as a teacher or as a student. Areas of specialization and ongoing study for David include modern theology and contemporary critical theory, pedagogy, and religion and culture. Today, he will talk about important items such as his book entitled Søren Kierkegaard's Theology of Encountered. Would you please welcome me in inviting David up to stand?
Thank you all for gathering here this afternoon. It's a real joy and pleasure to be back in Northfield. I was here in 2014 when I was a Kierkegaard Foundation fellow. And at that time, I was just finishing the PhD and working on an article. And basically, since then, that PhD has been revised a bit into the book that I'm going to be speaking about today. So it feels like a homecoming, and now I can offer a bit of something back of what I've been working on. I should also say that I'm not actually in the academy anymore. I took a position at a school in Winnipeg, Manitoba, just a few hours north of here. It's called the Center for Christian Studies, and it's a school that trains diaconal ministers in the United Church of Canada and the Anglican Church of Canada. Now, how many of you have heard of diaconal ministers? Or deacons? Yeah, so there's a couple hands, but not too many. So it's kind of a lesser-known order of many churches. Lutheran churches have deacons, Anglican, Catholic, and many other Reformed and Protestant churches do too. And the deacon, as I've come to learn about this, is someone whose role is primarily being the kind of hands and feet of the church outside the walls of the church. It's very much focused on social justice. Particularly the school that I work at has a kind of keen history in feminist theology and liberation theologies. And so that's the tradition that I've stepped into since finishing my PhD. And so what's interesting for me is that the work that I've done on this book prior to going to that institution, now I'm actually kind of reinterpreting some of the words that I've put on paper now in this new context of diaconal ministry. And I may have a chance to say a few more words about that at the end. But that's just to give you a bit about me. So what I thought I would do is just tell you today, we'll go through kind of an overview of the book. So this is I'm not presenting a philosophical or theological paper specifically. I'm just going to give you a sense of the shape of the book, and then we can have a bit of discussion around some of the different component pieces within it, if that's suitable. I'm also in the middle of a road trip. I was just in Chicago for about a week, and then now I'm on my way back to Winnipeg after I'm visiting with you here today. So I'm in motion. So this book, it tries to do a couple of things at once, which, how we're always warned against multitasking, but nevertheless, I've tried to do a couple of things at once. And one of them is to attempt to communicate to a few different constituencies. So what I've done is I've entered into a couple of debates within Kierkegaard scholarship and have suggested that there is a coherence to his apparently disparate and disjointed authorship. And despite his reputation for kind of psychological inwardness and the characteristic, this characteristic of faith as an isolating leap into the absurd, I'm more convinced that the goal and hope of his authorship is to deepen connections, relationships, and interactions between people in public life, between the people who make up the church, and between individuals and God. So I'm making a case for how to read Kierkegaard theologically, which shows coherence of his authorship and which is careful not to neglect the outwardly social aspects of his existential religiosity. And I want to just make a note that when I speak of coherence, I'm not confusing that with systematic philosophy. I'm not saying Kierkegaard is a systematic philosopher. I believe he's clearly not, but I do want to suggest that there is a kind of coherence to his thought. Another constituency I'm addressing in the book is contemporary European and North American Christianity, its theologians and practitioners. And the questions that I'm addressing for this group have to do with what it means to be or become a Christian in such a way that nourishes open and diverse communities of social and spiritual depth, and how to oppose the imperialist and nationalist or otherwise domineering forms of Christianity associated with Constantinian Christianity. So those are the people who I'm speaking to, primarily in this work. So let me proceed by explaining the title of the book, and then by explaining the title, that will give us an overview of the project as a whole. So we can begin with encounter. Why a theology of encounter? Well, for a number of years, I've been interested in how much or how little Kierkegaard's Christian existentialism is able to address some of the emancipatory ideals of the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century, which strive for a rich social life based on equality, cooperation, and mutual regard. The antitheses to these are hierarchy, social stratification, competitiveness, and chauvinisms of every kind, whether it's race, class, or gender. So this second list indicates conditions of separation and division, whereas the first list indicates conditions of relationship. And this is one reason why I choose the word encounter. So encounter is meant to signify and emphasize the process whereby real relationships are formed and developed. Okay, I also speak of encounter because I'm sure that Kierkegaard's individual is not a solitary, self-making, self-sufficient individualist. And so therefore I begin my study with a quotation that is likely familiar to many of you, taken from the journals of 1847. And it reads, "Despite everything, people ought to have learned about my maieutic carefulness, by proceeding slowly and continually, letting it seem as if I knew nothing more, not the next thing. They will probably bawl out that I do not know what comes next, that I know nothing about sociality. The fools. Yet, on the other hand, I owe it to myself to confess before God that in a certain sense there is some truth in it, only not as people understand it. Namely, that continually when I have first presented one aspect clearly and sharply, then the other affirms itself more strongly. Now I have the theme for my next book. It will be called Works of Love." So this, I believe, highlights a set of problems within Kierkegaard's authorship. One, he acknowledges that there are questions lingering about the social implications and relevance of his thought. And he claims he's actually concerned with sociality, and it will be affirmed in his work. And he suggests that people are inattentive to how his social contribution is already present inversely in the category of the individual. And yet, despite these reassurances, criticisms persisted. So his contemporaries doubted his interest in social life, particularly Hans Lassen Martensen, lifelong interlocutor and theological rival, wrote of Kierkegaard that he did not want to found any congregation or establish any new society. He totally denied every notion of society or associations, and he looked only to individuals. And so many prominent theorists and philosophers and theologians of the 20th century came to the same conclusions, and I'm sure many of us are familiar with that list. What is revealing about Kierkegaard's journal entry is how he responds to criticisms like Martensen's. So he admits there is some truth to this. And he does not attempt to found a new religious sect or endorse an old one. Neither does he strive to establish new political administrations or endorse old ones. According to Kierkegaard, politicking and statecraft and the pursuit of legal legislative authority, including doctrinal forms of authority, is producing an alienating and insipid form of sociality, which he calls bourgeois Philistinism. And therefore, that kind of political life is not desirable. Instead, for Kierkegaard, it is the category of the individual that he first presents clearly and sharply as his corrective to this alienating sociality of the present age. This, he tells us, is the decisive category. It's the category of spiritual awakening, and it is the category through which, in a religious sense, the age, history, and the human race must go. So this category of the individual is, in a sense, the goal of Kierkegaard's existence philosophy. And against the social backdrop of the 19th century, Kierkegaard describes it as the category that must be brought into relief. So here we have a movement that he talks about in the point of view, which is basically from society, from the public, to the individual. That's the move that he says much of his authorship is making. So to extract the individual from this kind of alienated social life. But what I want to do is, in this book, is take the next step, which I think he talks about primarily after 1846, which is to reintroduce the individual into a more loving, neighborly, and constructively critical society. So the movement of the book is away from the alienating society of the present age that he names, and then reintroduce the individual as an agent for upbuilding a more genuine and neighborly society. So, and then that brings us to the edifying and the polemical. So this is the subtitle of the book. So the book is called Kierkegaard's Theology of Encounter, an Edifying and Polemical Life. So this is where I describe how he's going to do this reintegration. And I identify two main qualifications of the religious life that are prominent in Kierkegaard's authorship after 1846, which I believe bring the social task forward. And that is, as I've said, the edifying and the polemical. The edifying is the upbuilding aspect of religious life, and the polemical is the more critical component. And we see this in The Sickness Unto Death. Anticlimacus writes, from the Christian point of view, everything, indeed everything, ought to serve for upbuilding. And in the point of view we read, the true Christian qualification is polemical within or away from finitude toward the eternal. So a corollary of this is the claim that the essentially religious person is always polemical. So he's holding these two things together. The edifying and the polemical is what make up the religious life. So what I believe Kierkegaard offers sociality in terms of a social praxis is based on this dialectic of the edifying and the polemical. And I'm suggesting that Kierkegaard's effort after 1846, and I located basically between 1846 and 1852, so I cut off my project before the attack campaign, and I have a particular reason why I do that, and I may mention that later. But basically, after 1846, the task is to present these two pieces together as existential requirements for Christian existence so that it can appear again as a task beckoning, as he says in Point of View. So that covers the title. We've got a theology of encounter, and the edifying and the polemical are these two religious components that he's going to bring together. But I also see this dialectic is supported by a couple theological positions. And they are also they kind of run parallel through this argument as well. And one is based out of the postscript, where Climacus writes, precisely because there is the absolute difference between God and creature, humanity must express itself most perfectly when it absolutely expresses the difference. So, on the one hand, there is a qualitative difference between God and creature. Okay? And then I also want to say that there is an intimate proximity between God and creature. This is another theological piece that I believe runs strongly throughout his later work. And here, it is the belief that God, out of love and commitment, becomes existentially invested in human existence, and that humans are invited into the intimacy and fullness of divine life. And we see this mostly, but not exclusively, but mostly in the upbuilding discourses, in works of love, and in Christian discourses. And also in different ways in Sickness unto Death. And so as a result of these two pieces, as a result of these two principles of proximity and difference comes a third, that all of our relationships are implicated in and informed by the human-divine relationship. So an acknowledgement of God's gift of life and love binds individuals to a life of love and upbuilding. Thus we read in works of love that Christianity's task is humanity's likeness to God, but God is love, and therefore we can be like God only in loving, can only be God's co-workers in love. This is what gets developed as the theology of encounter. So, what I also want to do in this text is situate this discussion, so it's not just an abstract theological piece of reflection, but that I believe that for Kierkegaard, he's actually quite contextual. And so I identify three locations where these encounters of the edifying and the polemical will take place. The first, I say, is in the church, in confession and communion. And I focus on his discussions in upbuilding discourses and Christian discourses, where we locate now that in the church, on the occasion of confession, is when an individual can acknowledge that qualitative difference between God and creature. And what a person confesses for Kierkegaard is not anxiety or guilt, but what a person comes to confess is the character of God. And for Kierkegaard, that character has to be a God of love. And in Upbuilding Discourses, he writes, if the slightest thing happened that could demonstrate, or could even merely appear to demonstrate that God was not love, well, then all would be lost. Then God would be lost. For if God is not love, and if he is not love in everything, then God does not exist at all. So this is the essential character of God that Kierkegaard wants to uphold, but he also recognizes that it's certainly not obvious that this is true. And so it becomes a task, actually, to demonstrate that God is love in the world. And that links us with communion. So in the first section, what I do is I kind of take a liturgical way through church, where Kierkegaard invites individuals into church on Fridays, and he's very specific about coming to Friday services, partly because that's a service that's not linked with social obligation as the Sunday services were at his time. So those who arrive on Fridays are there because they particularly want to be in the house of God before God, and that's really the task for him, is to exist before God. So we move from entering into the church, which symbolizes that kind of removal from the public, the mass, into a place of spiritual reflection, where someone can deepen themselves, and then so through confession, then they go towards the communion table. So basically, the point for this is to just emphasize that there is occasion, place, and practice in Kierkegaard's writing. It's linked with specific doings and places. From there, from there, then he takes the person outward into the world. And so the second location is this encounter with society. And here I split the task in two. One is the polemical critique, which we get in 2 Ages, where he has his critique of the public and the press. And then on the flip side of that, the edifying piece is with works of love, so building up a society of neighbors. The encounter with society is framed polemically as a critical encounter with alienating and domineering forces of modern society, and the edifying project of building up an open society of neighbors through works of love. And as I've just kind of indicated, I frame Kierkegaard's critique of modernity around 3 specific targets. There's the public, the press, and politicians. And the public is the abstract construction of a primarily bourgeois liberal press and party politics. And Kierkegaard's critique is based on his belief that these forces confuse homogeneity or an all-embracing cultural identity with equality. And they confuse majority with right. And Kierkegaard suspects that there's more domineering self-interest from the very limited voices who claim to speak on behalf of the public. So that's the basis of the critique of culture, and I think often we read his critique of the public as quite reactionary and kind of anti-democratic, and I think that there are certainly tones of that there, but I would suggest that his critique is more directed at actually the forces that are emerging in society at the time that would actually be dominating society rather than liberating it. And then the third encounter and final encounter of the text is to go back into the church as a critique of Christendom. And now the targets are the professors and the priests, which kind of mirror the politicians and the press. So they do the same work as far as I'm concerned. They basically are the leveling agents of the church. And they are kind of emptying out the existential requirement of Christianity and turning it into a kind of European cultural achievement. So that's the shape of it. But one thing I want to do at the end of the book is to still kind of claim some kind of ecclesiology, so that while I'm saying that Kierkegaard is critical of the church structure, and there's a benefit to wanting to, basically disestablish the church and to dismantle Christendom, I still want to suggest that there is reason for him to be together in a religious way. And then I basically conclude by saying it's confession and communion that are the reasons why people, like religious individuals, would want to actually gather together. And so the ability to hold these pieces together, the edifying and the polemical, in an existential life, this is what I'm calling the militant faith. And the task of becoming a militant church is the ability or the capability of being able to be both edifying and polemical. So that's the shape of it all. What I can do now is I'll see if there's any questions about that, and then what I can do is just enter into a specific discussion in the text around building up a diverse society of neighbors, because I think that's maybe the piece that is less common. But are there any questions about the shape or anything that I've said so far? Yes?
How did you choose the name militant faith?
Yes.
Or that combination of the polemical and the edifying?
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
Mm-hmm. So that's a good question, and the reason why I chose the language of militant, I'm taking it from his discussion of the difference between a triumphant church and a church militant, and that the church militant is one that he would say is a church that's in the process of becoming. And the danger of a church triumphant for him is the idea of a church that believes it has arrived at the goal. And so I've translated that into the kind of individual task as well, and the kind of corporate social task of being in a process of becoming. But to give a bit more clarity to what becoming involves, I'm saying that it's actually this, it's conjoining the edifying and the polemical aspects of religiousness, and that's what is the striving, struggling component. Yeah. Anything else? Nope. Okay. So in the time remaining, what I thought I would do is just give you a bit of more specific discussion in the book around the upbuilding, around edifying and building up a diverse society. Because I think that perhaps this is the one area where there might be less discussion from other sources. So the piece that I'm going to share with you, it comes after the critique of society. So after I've spent some time with Kierkegaard's critique of the press and the public, now I want to show how he's actually interested in forming more genuine relationships. So it's not just all about ranting at society, but actually how can we enter into genuine, loving relationships. So then, so I'll begin with a piece that he says about love. And it's classic Kierkegaardian circularity here, so just we'll take our time. What love does, that it is. What it is, that it does. At the same moment it goes out of itself, it is in itself. And at the same moment it is in itself, it goes out of itself in such a way that this outward going and this returning are simultaneously one and the same. So, love must go out of itself. The Kierkegaardian individual does not have a private love affair with her or himself, and neither should religious love be confused with a kind of spiritual ecstasy or love affair with the divine. The edifying is edifying only as activity directed towards others. All of its expressions are turned outward toward people. A love that goes out of itself is a productive force. It lures the good forth out of others, building up or upbuilding. It is the activity of what Kierkegaard calls loving forth, or opelsker. So this now, how do we do this? How do we actually build up others? So when it is time to actually love the real neighbors we see, and we know that time is always now, then what we are required to love is the distinctiveness of the other. What is distinctiveness? Ferreira suggests Kierkegaard's use of distinctiveness and one's own can be translated into the contemporary idiom of alterity and otherness. Those terms are helpful for understanding the real intersubjective predicament that people are somehow irreducibly different from each other. Yet for Kierkegaard, distinctiveness is not merely recognition of irreducibility. There are identifiable qualities that we must actively look for, nurture, and constructively build up in others. In this way, love of neighbor is not like the love for humanity or species in general, or difference as difference, because it is more concrete than those determinations. So how then does Kierkegaard explain distinctiveness? He says, distinctiveness is God's gift by which he gives being to me, and indeed gives being to all. God gives in such a way that the receiver acquires distinctiveness, that he who creates out of nothing yet creates distinctiveness, so that the creature in relation to God does not become nothing, but becomes a distinctive individuality. This, according to Kierkegaard, is the miracle of being, which is related to his concept of freedom and the existential ethical task of self-choice. Distinctiveness is how a person becomes a self, how she or he takes possibility back into necessity, and what she forms out of that process. Perhaps just important as what is given is the fact that something is given. That distinctiveness is related to a gift also brings the concept together with Kierkegaard's explanation of love's self-giving origin, the ground of love upon which all love builds up. Through an understanding of distinctiveness, one learns how to love selflessly for edification. So to become a self before God, which we have identified as the religious basis of human equality and obligation, is also for Kierkegaard the origin of all distinctiveness. This task of becoming a self, we have a common middle term. Therefore, a person who believes that she exists before God is also compelled by reason and required by conscience to believe in the distinctiveness of others. To have distinctiveness is to believe in the distinctiveness of everyone else, he writes in Works of Love. This is the point at which our social attention is directed to persons rather than demographics. There is another aspect of distinctiveness that is accessible and understandable apart from religious terminology and Christian belief. Our existential status, existing in a process of becoming, means that we are unfinished creatures, and therefore, to some extent, we remain a riddle to ourselves. Martin Matustik suggests following Climacus, that to be a riddle means to embody a question about one's total claim to living. As we encounter others, we can present ourselves in the honesty of our openness as unfinished and a riddle to ourselves, and expect to reach the other in their riddle as well, in the riddle of their distinctiveness. So rather than being a fixed set of characteristics or an already established ethical religious individual that one sets for oneself, distinctiveness then is also the aim of our responsibility towards others, and it is the model for our loving activity. If what it means to be a creature is to actualize the possibility of distinctiveness, which corresponds to the possibility of a God relationship, then that informs the aim of every edifying practice as an effort towards nurturing this distinctiveness. Likewise, the human activity of love that does not seek its own participates in making room for the distinctiveness of others. By implication, then, seeking one's own makes no room for distinctiveness, shutting it out or smothering it. So as we are commanded to love our neighbor without reference or consideration for distinctions, so are we instructed to truly love the distinctiveness of our neighbors. And here we have the thesis of Kierkegaard's fourth discourse of the series of Works of Love, which love does not seek its own. And he writes, the truly loving one does not love his own distinctiveness, but in contrast loves every human being according to their own distinctiveness. But the other person's distinctiveness is what for that person is their own. That is, the loving one does not seek one's own, quite opposite. The loving one loves what is the other's own. So the command to love the neighbor, which first demands blindness to distinctions and dissimilarity, now distinguishes itself by loving the diverse. And that's from Works of Love. It says it distinguishes itself from loving the diverse. Works of Love 270. So, going forward socially then, Kierkegaard offers us two paths. Either to strive to edify and love other people's own distinctiveness, or to follow what he calls the small-minded path of the domineering ones who seek their own exclusive benefit. Our choice is between a diverse, open, and mutually edifying society or a closed, competitive society characterized by antagonism, resentment, and will to power. Kierkegaard adopts a more cynical view of the path of what he calls small-mindedness. The social task of religiousness presented here is to humanly struggle for an open and edifying society. That struggle involves developing an oppositional or polemical stance towards the logic of selfishness, possession, and domination, while attending to the distinctiveness of others. Kierkegaard regards difference and variation in humanity as a human good. Reminiscent of Anticlimacus's comment that the self is intended to be ground into shape, not ground down smooth, and weary of a social tendency towards homogeneity and leveling, Kierkegaard again brings forward the ethical religious commitment to particularity. A diversity of distinctiveness is welcomed because it testifies to the truth and authenticity of everyone's own distinctiveness before God. People who acknowledge their own distinctiveness ought to have an attitude of openness toward others, since they are aware of encountering the distinctiveness in other people. And he writes, "For someone who has distinctiveness, no strange distinctiveness is a refutation, but rather a confirmation, or one more demonstration of the God relationship. It cannot disturb him to have it become manifest that everyone, as he believes, has distinctiveness." So what Kierkegaard is getting at here is that he's allowing for, or he's actually demanding that we pay attention to the distinctiveness of others rather than trying to ground down smooth society. And what he does is he opposes this to the small-mindedness of domineering ideologies. Kierkegaard relates the small-minded obsession with one's own to the domineering form of a tyrant. The domineering person seeks his own so that wherever he points, he can say, "See, it is my image, it is my idea, it is my will." Whether the rigid and domineering person is assigned a large sphere of activity or a small one, whether he is a tyrant in an empire or a domestic tyrant in a little attic room, essentially makes no difference. The nature is the same. So here we recognize the very antithesis to what's loving and edifying. Instead of working to make room for the distinctiveness that is genuine and a creative gift from God, small-mindedness hopes to transform all that is into a form that resembles itself, or is at least agreeable to it. This is why the domineering person cannot create anything, but either transforms or displaces everything that's in its way. The domineering person lacks the pliability to comprehend others, and instead demands everyone be transformed into his small-mindedness. When small-mindedness encounters a form that is not congruous with its own, it meets this distinctiveness with contempt. So he writes, small-mindedness feels a clammy, uncomfortable anxiety upon seeing an unfamiliar distinctiveness, and nothing is more important to it than to get rid of it. Small-mindedness demands of God, as it were, that every such distinctiveness be destroyed, so that small-mindedness will be shown to be in the right and God to be a jealous God, jealous for small-mindedness. Because small-mindedness does not truly believe in its or anybody's distinctiveness, it is suspicious and insecure amidst difference, which easily results in violence of sectarianism, sexism, racism, nationalism, and the destructive operations of empire. So then, to conclude, how to correct this? Well, what I want to suggest is that Kierkegaard offers a correction of communication. And that basically, I'm going to abbreviate quite heavily here. Basically what he's looking for is, he says, the task of communication is to set the other free. And this is from concluding unscientific postscript. And the question is the how of this communication. And this is where indirect communication, I think, meets the work of love. And so love that goes out of itself is a form of communication that is indirect. It is irreligious to want to communicate religiousness and subjectivity directly, because that is a betrayal of the difficulty implicated in existence communication. Likewise, there is a kind of knowledge the kind of knowledge at issue is a matter of appropriation, as it is for religiousness and ethical truth. And so therefore the question again is about how rather than what. So for Climacus, communication has the double function of A, it must be a way of expressing in existence the truth of one's subjectivity without objectifying it inwardness, and it must work for the existential spiritual emancipation of others. And where I see this happening most interestingly in works of love is in a discourse called The Victory of the Conciliatory Spirit. And here he says that to help another, or to be helped, is to know that one is helped by, oh goodness, sorry. Right, here it is. Kierkegaard, making use of a grammatical device, is able to express how social spiritual contradiction is surmounted. And the contradiction is this, that one stands on one's own through another's help. But this piece that he says through another's help is behind a dash. And so this dash is the kind of grammatical device that he uses to say that we do this indirectly and silently and invisibly. So to stand on one's own through another's help. So the task of the edifying person is to be able to build up someone behind this dash of invisibleness. So this was an opportunity to, after giving you the broad shape of the book, to try to go into a specific part of the text where I kind of look at how he criticizes the domineering forms of relationship, and then presents an edifying piece to build up others. So I think I'll stop there and give us some time for discussion. But so that's the broad shape of the book, and then a specific component. So thank you for your time.